Jeff, I'm looking forward to the end of the women's multi-format points series, mostly at the moment, between Australia and India. Their test match finished in a stalemate on Sunday. It looked for about an hour as though that wasn't going to be the case when Lanning declared about 139 runs behind, I think it was, so having just passed the follow-on. It was kind of immaterial whether she declared or not because the final wicket would have fallen and the same dance would have played out in the third innings. But at one stage, India were going at about fours, 70 for none, with Mandana having made a century in the first innings, batting beautifully again alongside Shafali Verma. But as soon as Mandana got out, even though they changed the batting order briefly, it looks like the wind came out of the sails. And if there were any chance of winning the test match, they needed to declare with sort of 55 overs remaining, not 32 overs remaining, and which meant they shook hands after 10 or whatever it was and called the whole thing off, which I thought was a little bit of a shame because the probability of Australia hauling down 240 in, let's call it 53 overs was so low on the final day of a test match. It was, really from that point, one team can genuinely win, and that's India, and they didn't sort of grasp that opportunity. And I reckon, Jeff, that's largely due to the fact that women don't play enough multi-day cricket rather. If you play, if that was a championship game or a shield game, I think both captains would have been savvy enough to have realised that this is about getting the third innings out of the way as quickly as possible. The fielding team would have been satisfied with leaking runs, and the batting team would have been like, we are changing the order, we are putting the foot down, wickets do not matter, we're declaring as soon as we get to about a lead of 240. But that natural conservatism that we've seen before in women's test cricket prevailed. And I think, it comes back to that idea they only get one chance every couple of years, and you don't want to be seen to have fucked it up.
You only get one shot, do not miss your chance to blow, as Eminem once wisely told us. Look, it was pretty frustrating watching that last day. It felt like a situation where, follow-on in a 5-day match is 200, follow-on in a 4-day match is 150. Australia got cautious trying to get past the follow-on because there were wickets falling and they were anxious and it was taking time. That was the kind of situation where Lanning could have cooked up a sort of Hansi leather jacket sort of situation with Mitali Raj and said, if we declare behind the follow-on, will you agree not to enforce it? And do it that way, get them, get that third innings happening a bit sooner in the day. That was one possibility, particularly, when, as I said, as wickets started to fall, you could tell it was going to take longer for Australia to hit the follow-on mark if they were going to do it. So there was that, and then there was the lack of urgency with which India went about things when they batted, but also the defensiveness of the Australians in the field. They had the field pretty well spread. They were looking to stop boundaries and so on, which, what's the point at that stage? You want your opposition to score. You don't necessarily want to Bert Vance it and bowl a 17 ball over that goes for 70 runs, but you want them to get a bit of a wriggle on. And so, it just, as you say, that baked in conservatism that you don't want to be the team to lose the test match, and you're more scared of that than being the team to win the test match. So, Mitali Raj declaring with 32 overs left and then calling the game off after 15 of them. There's still 17 overs to play and they're 2 down at that point. It's not inconceivable that you could still win that test. Like, it's probably not likely, but why not bowl the last 17 overs? Why not see if you can get a panic to happen? But also, as you say, why not give yourself 50 overs instead of 32?
Yeah, I agree. I wasn't actually watching the very end of it. I was watching our friend and final word contributor Will McPherson run the London Marathon at the very end, and thus I didn't see the declaration. But I watched until quite deep into India's second innings, and it struck me that Lanning and the Brains Trust in the Australian team didn't quite clock that it was in their interest to let India score at 5 or 6 and over, or even 4 and over, consistently through. It was in their interest for India to declare quicker, because then they had a chance to win the game. And you can only read Lanning's declaration at 139 behind as evidence that they wanted to try and chase in the fourth innings. It wasn't as though they were batting until they were all out. And, then you might have some doubt in that. But Heather Knight did a similar thing in Taunton back in 2019. She declared, I reckon, Jeff, about 140 behind. But on that occasion, Australia in the third innings had no incentive to bat quickly or to give England any total to chase, because they only needed a draw to guarantee they would retain the women's Ashes. Yep. They'd won the one day as 3-0. They needed 8 points to secure the retention, and thus Meg Lanning and Matt Mott were very clear that they were relaxed about, not offering up England a grandstand finish. In fact, they said that England didn't deserve the chance to win the game, and they were right. They were accurate when they said that because they'd outplayed England across 3 days. The same, in a way, could be said of the fact that India deserved to win the game more than Australia did in terms of sessions won and passages of play. The decisive passages of play through the 4 days were largely won by India. But India needed to be willing to run the risk of losing, however infinitesimal, in order to get a chance to win with so much time lost out of the game. Which brings us back to the familiar conversation that you and I have had, I don't know how many times around women's Test cricket since we started covering it together in 2015. You need a fifth day. That's not just because of rain, although that's a part of it. It's because women's Test cricket is played at a slower tempo at this stage. Why? We don't have domestic women's long-form cricket. It's just played at a rhythm, which means that things take longer. And to acknowledge that, I don't see any and even if it is a fifth day worth 100 overs, does that mean that, is it a problem that their Test matches will have in them 50 overs longer or 50 overs more than men? Of course it's not a problem. I mean, we mess around with the number of overs in Test cricket with men as it is, whether they're playing over 5 or 4 days, which is now available to them since 2018. So I don't think we should get precious about this. Heather Knight was on the front foot, Jeff, on Twitter, talking about this yesterday, saying 5-day Test anyone. I hope that somebody at Cricket Australia is listening to Heather Knight, because she's scheduled to lead England in a Test match in their multi-format series, starting the series actually at Canberra at the end of January. So I hope that that smart heads get together and they realise that there is the potential to give these Test matches a better chance of reaching a result, because they seldom do at the moment.
Well, when you look at whether it's 100 overs a day or 90 overs a day across 5 days, it doesn't really matter. It is about spreading out the amount of time because of weather as well. When we look at the last few Test matches that have been played in women's cricket, England and India a couple of months ago, the previous Ashes one at Taunton, 2017 at North Sydney wasn't affected, but the other ones, these last three, have all had significant chunks of time lost to rain. There was more than a session on day one and day two of this most recent Test match were gone to rain. They got through, I worked out, probably about 314 out of 400 overs for the match, once you factor in 4 overs for changes of innings. The other change of innings happened at a break, so there was no lost time. They called it off 17 overs early. So if you count all of those as overs bowled, they were still 86 overs short for the match. And that would have been enough to set up a much more organic result, rather than, Australia would have been bowled out in normal time. India could have batted for a longer period of time and could have given themselves longer to try to bowl Australia out. And had they not succeeded in doing that, then a draw would have been a more, not a more worthy result, but a more
palatable,
fitting,
I reckon.
Fitting. A result that reflected the contest better. Whereas as it was, the contest only reflected that there wasn't able to be a contest. And had it been won in those circumstances with 3 declarations in the first 3 innings, it would have been a contrivance, and it would have been better than having a draw, but it wouldn't necessarily have felt like a triumph in the same sort of way. And so, honestly, I mean, Matthew Mott said this in the post-match presser, and I think that's quite a significant intervention from the Australian coach. He said, after to paraphrase him, after putting in all of the effort to set up the Test match and have it, how much really does it cost in terms of effort, time, money, whatever, to give us one more day to try to get a result in the Test match? We've had so many draws in women's Test cricket because, as you say, it's going to be played at a slower rate. Pace of the bowling is one thing that doesn't force breakthroughs as often. It's easier for a batter in a good groove to settle in and just play for a really long period of time. It's more possible to do that. The run rate ticks up a bit more slowly. The wickets don't generally fall as quickly. It's harder to get those fast forward sessions of play that suddenly move a Test match forward.
Yeah, and look, Hypercourse, John Leather, the great women's cricket statistician, pointed out there have been 142 women's Test matches played overall, and this is the 7th to feature 3 declared innings. So, you get a feel for that, don't you? If you're declaring 3 times in a match, you are trying to artificially move the game forward. By contrast, there have been 2,433 men's Test matches, only 6 have featured 3 declared innings. So the contrast there is clear. What we're seeing in women's cricket is a different pattern because they don't have a 5th day, and that's easy to fix. I'm glad Matt Mott said that. Look, I also saw some reportage overnight. I think Malcon had a piece about this, which reflected that some people in the hierarchy at CA didn't much fancy this being a test match to begin with because they could have devoted the resources or reallocated the money to having more women's Big Bash games on TV. So from that I read that even though there seems to be momentum for more women's test cricket and women's multi-day cricket, we're hearing a lot more from this. We heard from the Australian Cricketers Association a couple of months ago, for example, and sort of high-profile advocates who are out there on the front foot and are no longer sort of saying, well, every dollar spent in test cricket is a dollar that's not spent on growing the game with T20. There seems to be a balanced approach now that we can kind of have both the games grown to the point where women's test cricket can be a part of it. Well, I hope that that's a view that's also being maintained in the decision-making corridors at Jolimont and not just one from those sitting outside the tent. And I suppose the proof will be in the pudding next year. South Africa is scheduled to visit England next year. Will the ECB invite them to play a test match and conduct a multi-format points series? They didn't against New Zealand this year. They did against India. What about South Africa? They haven't played a test match for 7 years either. What about when India go home and they start hosting bilateral cricket again? Will they invite a team to play a test match? So the responsibility is sure on CA and in the short term whether they will have a 5th day at Manuka in January, but on other boards too. How committed to this are we, and how can we take the next steps to ensure that domestic competitions follow suit?
And fundamentally it's about what you as a cricketing culture hold up as important. Now, maybe if you're a young cricketer growing up in Nepal, maybe playing in the IPL would be the pinnacle of cricket for you. Maybe that would be the greatest thing to be, in front of a CSK home crowd going crazy, or playing for Sunrisers Hyderabad, and fairly so. In Australia, we still fetishise the baggy green. We still pump up Test cricket. Every male domestic player would, even if they're just parroting the lines, would say Test cricket is the pinnacle. CA market it that sort of way, the pinnacle of the sport, where you truly find out what you're made of. The baggy green is the sacred, artifact. All of this stuff, which even if it's a bit cringy, I think you and I we fundamentally have the same kind of attitude that Test cricket means more to us than other cricket does. You can't have that exist at the same time as you're not providing adequate opportunities for Australia's women's team to play Test cricket. Just can't do the two things cannot be true at the same time. It can't be the most important thing and also not important enough to make it accessible to the women's team. So more multi-format series teams other than the big 3 now. It's great that India have started doing it. Hope they keep going. Hope they host tests in their home conditions. And we see Meg Lanning batting on a raging Turner somewhere. This is exactly the kind of thing we want to see.
Yep.
It's got to be broadened out to other teams as they visit to let them have the opportunity to.
Yeah, well said, well summed up. I would just reinforce the idea that if you're a little girl growing up following cricket, it is wonderful that you will have women icons. I mean, when Winnie, I think about, it's hard not to put myself in as having a daughter now with this. When she grows up and watches cricket, as presumably she will, it's brilliant that she's going to be able to watch on television or go to the game and watch women play as role models. But it's unlikely that it's going to be the biggest cricket being played around the world. That's still going to be the preserve of men for the however long. They won't be on an even footing, and thus it'll be men's Test cricket, which is seen as the pinnacle of the sport. Certainly in Australia and England, I'm not speaking for India, that's not reasonable, but certainly Virat Kohli says that Test cricket means the most to him and others of his vintage too in that Indian dressing room. So on that basis, how can you then deny that opportunity to half the population, more than half the population? So what's that old campaign slogan? More to do, but heading in the right direction. Much as it is with DRS, I mean, it was annoying that DRS wasn't there, Jeff, but it certainly wasn't. I mean, this is one of those ones where I think sometimes well-intentioned people can miss the mark a little bit. People ploughing into Cricket Australia about DRS and not being there at that test match, that's not quite right, is it? I mean, this wasn't to do with CA. This was to do with the inability to get the technology across the border. I mean, there was going to be DRS had this been played in Perth as it was scheduled.
Yeah, the plan was for there to be DRS at the Wacker in Perth. They had to move the test to Queensland to the Gold Coast, and look, had Scasey been around, he might have been able to write the check. I don't know, honestly, if CA had ploughed a stupid amount of money into it, whether they would have been able to bribe the right people to get the trucks in or whatever it was. I don't know if it was logistically too difficult because of how much it would have cost, or if it was just impossible. But either way, it was a bridge too far to get it done for a ground that was only confirmed as the host of the match 3 weeks out, was it?
Yeah.
Something like that. So, yeah, it couldn't happen in that instance. There were a couple of wrong calls. Australia got the rough end of a couple of them as well, so it's not like it was something favouring the home team. It sucked that there was no DRS, but there was a reason for it, and there will be for the Ashes, as there would have been for the Perth Test.
How exciting is it, by the way, that we're going into the pointy end of a multi-format point system? That's a bit of a jarring sentence. But where I think India are the team in form. I think that India should... they'll have to win 3-0 to win the series overall. But if they win 2-1 from here in the T20s, they have played some very, very good cricket. They should have won the one day as 2-1. They dominated more of the Test match than Australia did by some margin. They should go in with plenty of belief in these T20s. And what a result it would be if they did end up winning 2 or 3 of the T20s, in terms of really reinforcing that message from the T20 World Cup last year, that they are a big dog and they are going to seriously contend with Australia and England, let's say, over the next generation or so. That's a great thing for women's cricket.
And that they're not rattled by choking in that one-day game in the second match that we talked about. The fact that they bounced back to win the next one in another close one and didn't bottle it that second time a close result came around, and all of that coming after they were wiped out in the first match. It's pretty significant. The significant omissions for Australia start to show as well. So Megan Shute not there to take the new ball. Jess Jonathan not there, who's just been the most important bowler for Australia in so many matches without being noticed, but she's so often the player who comes on, goes at 3.5 and over or something in a T20 and picks up two wickets and just does a job at taking the wheels off for the opposition. So those omissions seem important. Rachel Haynes, I'm not sure if she'll be fit either. And, Australia brought all the young gun quicks in for the Test match. They had Darcy Brown and Stella Campbell there, which was exciting to see for the future. But it seemed like the occasion got to them a little bit. They weren't particularly threatening in the first innings of that India innings that went on for about 2 days.
Yeah, and the story came out later that Stella Campbell required long spikes for her boots and didn't know what they were, and Mitchell Stark went and got her some. Like little, it's a reminder that that some part of the men's game haven't quite washed through the women's game yet, and it's small but a significant little story that came out after the fourth day there at the Gold Coast. But yeah, I just think that I know it's very difficult to criticise the Australian women's national cricket team. They've been a tour de force over the last 4 years especially. They've won everything. They've pretty much won every game in that stretch of time, be it 20 over, 50 over. I mean, they have been so dominant. But if they were to lose here, they will. Well, there should already be. I'm not covering this series in a written capacity, but there should be scrutiny over the way they played that Test match. I might not be allowed in the country for saying that the Australian women's cricket team didn't play as well as they might. They are such a protected species. But I tell you now, if they lose to India, that'll be a thing, and it should be recognised as a thing. And there shouldn't be any mollycoddling around this either. I mean, they have got, as Daniel Brettig wrote, all the resources in the world. Despite how India have grown in the women's game in the last 4 years, Australia still should have them covered with their second team, on the basis of the number of professional cricketers that are floating around. So yeah, for all of that and more, I'm pumped for the T20s.